Hello everybody, this is Albert. Recently, a rather memorable debate occurred between Dan Barker, who is a former Pentecostal minister, fundamentalist minister, and Reformed apologist. James White Barker is now an atheist. I'm bringing this up because it illustrates some points I'd like to make, and illustrates in the most convincing manner. The point is that a lot of what you see in debates between theists and atheists, or in discussion, or on either side, I mean, it's just not very good scholarship. Often the arguments are so poorly constructed by one side or the other as to make one wonder why anyone takes them seriously. But the difference, I suppose, is that there are some ends of Christianity, the fundamentalists, and for example, who eschew all that education stuff. But what happens is that many of the those in the skeptical community who used to be fundamentalists now believe they are being completely rational. It's kind of odd, because when you see them, they're really not. And they're doing the same things they did as fundamentalists, only now they're doing them for the other side. And this is what Dan Barker was doing in this debate, and I'm just going to be pointing this out, or has been doing actually for quite some time. Now think about this for a moment. You have someone who's essentially been raised in the most intellectually shallow and blindingly dogmatic end of Christianity. Is it really likely that somehow magically they will have laid aside all their former methodological errors and somehow transform themselves into the epitome of scholarly rational thought? I mean, is this really likely? I mean, it can happen. And I'm not speaking here of people like Bart Ehrman, who's a legitimate scholar. I mean, there are legitimate scholars on both sides. And the debates between them are like the Bart Ehrman Dan Wallace debate was fascinating, if anyone gets a chance to look at that. But I'm talking of the pop skeptics, like Barker, for example, and others whose every pronouncement is suddenly reproduced verbatim on hundreds, if not thousands, of websites. And the same is with what happens with Christian fundamentalists, where you'll see the same thing repeated on hundreds, if not thousands, of websites. The amazing thing is that once you check the sources, they all fall apart. Many are from completely unreliable works by crackpots who have no qualifications and give no sources for their wild speculations. They're just merely quoted because it says so. Others are from primary source material that, once checked, is saying something completely different than what's being asserted. Moreover, the citations look suspiciously uniform from book to book, from website to website, and makes one openly wonder if anyone's actually read any of it, or if they're merely regurgitating these same footnotes, just as those who copy them later will do. None of this is surprising, since many of these pop skeptics come from the ranks of fundamentalism. Then why should we expect them to use anything but fundamentalism's mythology? They just repeat what they've read in another book by another skeptic, just as the fundamentalists repeat what they read in another book by another fundamentalist, without checking anything. I see this constantly in fundamentalism. King James onlyism is a perfect example, and the same the lack of scholarly acumen permeates much of the skeptical web. You can take the boy out of the fundies, but you can't always take the fundy out of the boy. James White happens to be a very conservative Christian, and sometimes he's labeled a fundamentalist, but it's not really in the sense that I'm describing here. Some of those people might label me a fundamentalist, I suppose, so it doesn't really matter. He's certainly not the Peter Ruckman type. He's not even the Tim LaHaye type. I happen to disagree with him on any number of issues. He's a conservative Reformed Baptist. I'm a traditional High Church Anglican. But I've never seen him come to the table in any debate unprepared. He's checked everything. I may disagree with his interpretation, but in terms of the facts on the ground, he's usually pretty accurate. Then you argue about how to interpret it. In fact, he seems to check every possible permutation and prepare himself, and almost to the point of being retentive, and that's not meant as an insult. The topic of this particular debate was whether Jesus of the New Testament was derived from pagan mythology. Now, this happens to be a popular topic on the internet, but has no scholarly basis. There's just nothing there, and the evidence for it that they present simply doesn't stand up to even the lightest of examinations. In both of Barker's books, he made the usual asinine claims about Mithras and who knows what else, and relied on the work of such scholars as Barbara Walker, whom he labeled an historian, but whose only known field of expertise is knitting. The earlier book of Barker's two books has been in publication for 17 years, and that one was Losing Faith in Faith, the newer one, Godless, for about 2 years. Both are still being sold by Freedom from Religion Foundation that Barker's associated with, and were being sold in the location of the debate that day. For those unfamiliar with the formats of most formal debates, each side usually comes with a prepared presentation and a prepared opening presentation. It's common and expected to draw on your opponent's existing public work on the topic to prepare for your own presentation. Unless the work has been withdrawn or repudiated, the arguments in there are fair game so long as they are relevant. Then in later parts of the debate, you get to respond to what's already been put on the table. Now, during Barker's presentation, he completely almost ran away from his work and went in an entirely different direction, different sources of argumentation. White then began his presentation, started citing Barker's work, and Barker protested that he couldn't because he hadn't mentioned them himself. Of course, this is absurd. The moderator rejected it. The debate went on. Naturally, Barker's new arguments were of a far less reaching variety than the old ones, and White would effectively counter them in the rebuttal period. It became obvious that Barker had, in the preparation for the debate, found out that these claims were worthless. He could have been told by any number of other atheists, or True Carrier, for example. And knowing he would get skewered, reformulated them perhaps through the advice of others, and that this is a more rational way of going. It didn't work, and it was obvious he was not used to arguing these points, these new assertions, because he couldn't come up with responses to counter-arguments. Another interesting thing was his use, which is a common thing, of Justin Martyr allegedly claiming that Christianity was no different than paganism, here writing in the 2nd century. It's an often used citation, which essentially is taking a few sentences out of context. Once you place it in the context, it's entirely different. Of course, this is exactly what fundamentalists do all the time, so it looks like that technique is still sticking. Now, this is pretty much what you get. It's par for the course for Barker. You have to understand this. All you need to do is read his books. I've skimmed over them in the bookstore just to see if there was anything there of any importance, and it looked like the same stuff I read on the web hundreds of times. It's simply a Christian fundamentalist who quotes proof texts without any knowledge of their overall setting. Only now he's doing it for the other side, you see. He also cites the work of friendly secondary sources without checking anything. There is absolutely no difference between the research methodology of Dan Barker and that of Kent Hovind. Now, to illustrate this, to illustrate this methodology, let's give an example besides the one I just given. Barker claims to prove the Bible has God creating evil by citing a number of scriptural passages that use the Hebrew word ra. Now, ra can mean evil. It can also mean a number of other things, all usually indicating some sort of adversity, some bad stuff happening or whatever. It all depends on the context, though. He uses a number of passages that state God created ra. And since ra can mean evil, Barker concludes that it does mean evil, and therefore God created evil. With logic like that, is it any wonder this guy used to be a fundamentalist? Actually, he still is, as I said, just for a different team. All you need to do is look at the passages and see it makes no sense in that context. Take, for example, Isaiah 45:7, where ra is usually translated as calamity. Barker renders it evil, but it makes no sense in the context. It is in a sequence of poetic imperatives where God is creating opposites. The previous verse is light and dark, and this one is something akin to well-being and... Well, it doesn't really make sense to put evil in there. It would only if it said good and, right? It says well-being and so calamity or adversity makes sense, evil doesn't. And it simply, Barker's wrong. But this is indicative of Barker's scholarship throughout his work. Later in the debate, there was also an amusing point where Barker clearly was violating the rules, and this was pointed out to him. They had agreed that during question periods, they would only ask questions. You're not allowed to make any more arguments. And Barker was doing so, and it was pointed out to him. And he claimed that's one rule he was happy to break. Now, the declaration of the worthlessness of his promise may be typical of someone getting owned, but it did have one amusing consequence, at least in my mind. You see, later on that evening, Barker was engaging in a different debate on whether belief in God was necessary to be ethical or moral. Obviously, he missed the connection on that one. Since the debate, though, Barker's been engaging in damage control, When White posted the video confrontation over the book citations, Barker complained it might give people the wrong idea. How showing you speaking in the entire context of the word spoken gives the wrong idea is still yet to be explained. It does, however, underline that Barker does not want to be challenged on things he stood behind for almost 2 decades. You see, he's been exposed and doesn't want to admit it. He still doesn't want to admit that Walk was a worthless source, even though everyone knows it, because it would call into question his own credibility. But you know, he really shouldn't worry. Most intelligent skeptics don't pay any attention to him any more than most intelligent Christians pay attention to Hovind. There are even some websites out there of his fans claiming, oh, he did great. I won't bother pointing out the lack of lucidness in these claims. Only one side seems to want people to see the videos. Go take a look. I'll have him in the sidebar.